The silenced Glock 19 weighed heavy against Thane's ribs, and as he stepped into the antiseptic chill of the hospital corridor, he felt the weight of a decade-long war pressing against his chest like a tombstone. Fluorescent lights hummed with a low electric buzz against the white-tiled ceiling. Outside, Seoul was a neon blur of rain and exhaust. Inside, the air was suffocating, bleach, floor wax, and the sharp copper tang of impending death. The Black Sun lieutenants were stationed at the elevators, eyes cold, waiting for the signal. Room 402, that was the destination. 10 years. That's how long it had taken to corner the rival boss who had executed Thane's brothers. 10 years of calculated hits, of sleepless nights in armored cars, of building an empire on the charred remains of his own soul. All of it led to this final door. Thane's hand, knuckles scarred and tattooed with the ink of a killer, reached for the cold steel of the door handle. His jaw tightened. A single drop of sweat traced the line of his jaw. This was the moment. Step inside, pull the trigger, and cement his legacy as the undisputed king of the underworld. His second-in-command had spent months preparing this hit. We end the war tonight. We take the throne. But as the door creaked open, the smell of expensive leather met the scent of lilies, and a voice, as small and fragile as breaking glass, drifted from the shadows of a bed that wasn't room 402. The rhythmic squeak of Thane's Italian leather shoes was the only sound in the sterile corridor, a predatory cadence that felt like a countdown. Under the harsh, humming fluorescent lights, he was a shadow draped in a charcoal wool coat, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the clinical white walls. In the pocket of his coat, the weight of the Glock was a cold, grounding presence. He ran a thumb over the textured grip, feeling the familiar ridges that had defined his life for a decade. To the world, he was the dragon of the Black Sun, a man who dealt in the currency of fear. To himself, he was merely an auditor coming to collect a final overdue debt. He passed a nursing station, his eyes forward, never flickering. He had perfected the art of being invisible while in plain sight, the gait of a man who belonged, the steady breath of a professional. His mind was a tactical map of room 402. He visualized the layout, the position of the life support monitors, the angle of the bed, the 2-second window between opening the door and discharging the suppressed round. This wasn't just a hit, it was the closing of a book written in the blood of his brothers. The rival boss, Lee, was the last name on a list that had cost Thane his youth, his peace, and the very skin on his knuckles, now scarred and hidden beneath silk cuffs. The air in the hospital grew thinner, colder. It tasted of ozone and heavy-duty disinfectant. Every person he passed, a weary doctor, a weeping relative, felt like a ghost from a world he no longer inhabited. He was a creature of the dark, a wolf in a sanctuary of sheep. He checked his watch. The second hand swept forward with agonizing precision. 3 minutes until the shift change. 3 minutes until the security detail at the elevators rotated. He turned the corner of the 4th floor, his muscles coiled, ready for the explosive burst of movement that would end the war. His heart rate didn't climb, it slowed, reaching that icy stasis he only found in the moments before a kill. He saw the sign for the 400 wing, but a flicker in the overhead lights caused a momentary strobe effect, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. A heavy set of double doors stood before him. He pushed through them with the practiced ease of a man entering his own home, his hand already beginning to draw the weapon. But as the doors hissed shut behind him, the metallic tang of the surgical wing was replaced by something jarringly different. The scent of lavender, the faint sound of a music box, and the soft rhythmic hiss of oxygen concentrators that sounded like a collective sigh. Thane paused, his brow furrowing. This wasn't the sterile tomb of room 402. This was a place of soft colors and stuffed animals. He had stepped into the wrong world. The silence in this wing was different. In the corridors of power and the back alleys of soul, silence was a coiled snake, a warning of a strike to come. Here, the silence was heavy, thick with the exhausted prayers of parents and the fragile, shallow breathing of the small and the suffering. Thane stood frozen, his hands still gripped around the cold steel in his pocket. The air didn't smell like the iron of a fresh wound or the expensive tobacco of his boardroom. It smelled of lavender soap and the faint, dusty sweetness of a child's blanket. He looked up at the signage. A flickering fluorescent bulb above him buzzed like a dying insect, casting a strobe-like jitter over the plastic directory. In that erratic light, the 4 looked like a 1, and the directional arrow seemed to twist, pointing him deeper into a maze he hadn't prepared for. This was the pediatric oncology ward, the Valley of the Shadow, a place where the battles were fought not with bullets, but with white blood cell counts and sheer, desperate will. Thane should have turned back. Every instinct honed over a decade of survival screamed at him to retreat, to find the stairwell and reclaim his path to room 402. But as he turned to leave, his coat brushed against a colorful mural of a papier-mâché sun taped to a door. The sun was crooked, drawn with the shaky hand of someone who didn't have much strength left. It held his gaze, a bright, defiant splash of yellow in a world of clinical grays. He felt an unfamiliar friction in his chest, a grinding of gears that had been locked in ice for years. He was a man who moved with absolute certainty, yet for the first time, his feet felt heavy, as if the floor itself was trying to slow his march toward murder. The shadows in the hallway seemed to stretch toward him, not as threats, but as reaching arms. A soft, rhythmic clicking sound drew his attention toward a door left slightly ajar. It was the sound of a heart monitor, but the pace was wrong, too fast, too light, like the wings of a trapped bird. Thane found himself drifting toward the gap in the door, drawn by a gravity he couldn't name. He told himself he was just checking for witnesses, ensuring his exit was clear. But as he peered into the dim, violet-hued light of the room, he saw a small, pale hand resting on a guardrail, the skin so translucent it looked like fine porcelain. He was a predator in a nursery, a wolf who had stumbled into a sanctuary of lambs. He took one step back, his heel clicking sharply on the linoleum, and in that instant, the small hand stirred. Thane froze. The sharp click of his heel against the floorboards felt like a gunshot in the heavy quiet of the room. He should have vanished. He should have melted back into the darkness of the hallway and completed his dark errand in the other wing. But before he could pivot, a voice drifted through the violet shadows. A sound so thin and airy it barely seemed to possess the weight of human breath. "Daddy?" The word hit Thane with more force than any physical blow he had ever sustained. He stayed perfectly still, his hand still buried in his coat pocket, gripping the cold, unfeeling steel of his weapon. He didn't breathe. He didn't move. He watched as the small, porcelain-pale hand on the guardrail tightened its grip, the knuckles appearing like tiny river stones beneath the skin. "You're late," the voice whispered, trembling with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "I told the nurses you'd come. I told them you wouldn't let me go alone." Thane's eyes adjusted to the dim light. The girl, Noem, was propped up against a mountain of white pillows that seemed to swallow her small frame. Her eyes were large, glassy with fever and something else, a terrifyingly calm lucidity. She wasn't looking at him with the eyes of the world. She was looking through the darkness, seeing a silhouette that fit the shape of the man she had been waiting for. "I was getting scared," she continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. She gestured with a weak, trembling finger toward the shadowed corner of the room near the ceiling. The angels are already here. They've been waiting in the corner for an hour. They're very bright, Daddy. Can't you see them?" Vane looked into the empty corner. There was nothing there but the hum of a ventilation grate and the rhythmic blinking green light of an infusion pump. Yet as he looked back at the child, a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning raced down his spine. He was a man who had made a career out of creating ghosts, but he had never stood in the presence of one that was inviting him in. The girl reached out, her arm shaking from the sheer effort of defying gravity. Her palm was open, a silent, desperate invitation. "Please," she sobbed softly, a single tear tracking through the translucent pallor of her cheek. "Hold my hand, just until we get to the gate. It's so bright, and I don't want to go by myself." Vane looked at his own hand, the hand that had broken bones, pulled triggers, and signed death warrants. It was scarred, calloused, and stained with a history he could never wash away. He looked at the door, the gateway back to his empire and his rival. Then he looked at the smallest chain, a tiny, fragile hand reaching out from the brink of eternity. Vane took a half step toward the door, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the hollow of his ribs. This was a mistake. Every second spent in this room was a second the black sun was left without its head, a second his enemies had to breathe. His mission was in room 402. His loyalty was to the dead who had put him on this path, not to the dying who sought to derail it. He turned his face away from the girl's pleading gaze, his eyes fixing on the sterile, indifferent glow of the hallway. But then his eyes caught the light on her arm. The IV line was taped down with transparent plastic, and beneath it, the skin of her forearm was a map of violet and yellow bruises, the wreckage of failed veins and repeated needles. The sight acted like a jagged blade, slicing through the thick, calloused armor Thane had spent a decade forging. Suddenly, he wasn't in a high-security hospital in Seoul. He was back in a rain-slicked alley in Busan 20 years ago, clutching the cooling hand of his younger sister. He remembered the way the light had left her eyes, the way her small fingers had gone slack in his grip, while the world around them continued to move as if her disappearance meant nothing. He had promised then that he would never be weak again. He had traded his heart for a throne of glass and iron so that he would never have to feel the crushing weight of a hand letting go. Noem let out a small, jagged whimper, her fingers trembling in the air between them. "Don't go," she whispered, her voice thinning into a silver thread. "The light is getting too big, Daddy. Stay." The Glock in his pocket felt like a lead weight, an anchor pulling him down into the depths of a life he suddenly found repulsive. The dragon wanted to flee, to run back to the safety of his violence and his certainties. But the man, the boy who had watched his sister fade in a gutter, could not move. His feet were rooted to the linoleum. Slowly, with the agonizing deliberation of a man surrendering his last weapon, Thane pulled his hand from his pocket. It was empty. He reached out and pulled the heavy vinyl-covered guest chair toward the bed. The metal legs shrieked softly against the floor, a sound of mourning. He sat down. His massive frame looked absurd in the small, cramped space of the pediatric ward, his expensive wool coat bunching around his shoulders. He reached out and, for the first time in 20 years, used his hand for something other than destruction. He slid his scarred, tattooed palm beneath Noem's tiny, cold hand. Her fingers immediately closed around his thumb with a desperate, instinctive strength. The silence returned, but it was different now. The predator was gone. There was only a man sitting in the dark, watching the shadows, waiting for the angels Noem saw to make their move. The door creaked open, admitting a sliver of harsh, artificial light from the hallway that cut across the darkened room like a scalpel. Nurse Halen Moore stepped inside, her rubber-soled shoes silent on the floor. She carried a tray of fresh IV fluids and a digital thermometer, her movements efficient and weary. She didn't look up immediately, her mind occupied by the endless cycle of vitals and dosages that defined her 12-hour shift. But then she saw him. Halen froze, her breath hitching in the back of her throat. She lived in a neighborhood where the Black Sun Syndicate was more than a rumor, it was the climate. She recognized the sharp, expensive cut of the charcoal coat and the intricate dragon scales that crept up the back of the hand resting on the bed rail. She knew that face from the news, from the grainy CCTV footage of boardroom takeovers and the hushed whispers of the city's terrified poor. A predator had invaded her sanctuary. Her first instinct was to reach for the emergency alarm, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But as her eyes adjusted to the violet gloom, the scream died in her throat. Thane didn't move, he didn't reach for a weapon or offer a threat. He sat hunched in the small chair, his broad shoulders bowed as if under a physical weight. The most feared man and soul was anchored to the spot by the tiny, frail hand of a 6-year-old girl. Halen watched as Noem's fingers twitched in her sleep, and Thane's hand instinctively tightened, not with the grip of a captor, but with the desperate tenderness of a man holding a lifeline. Halen set the tray down on the bedside table, her fear slowly transmuting into a profound, heavy awe. She saw the silenced pistol bulging beneath his coat, and then she looked at the way he was watching Noem's shallow chest rise and fall. She realized then that this wasn't an infiltration, it was an altar. Her fever broke an hour ago, Halen whispered, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still humming in her veins. Thane's head snapped up, his eyes hard and cold, the instinct of the wolf returning for a fleeting second. But when he saw the nurse, the exhaustion in her eyes and the smudge of ink on her scrubs, the fire in his gaze flickered and went out. He looked exhausted, stripped of his titles and his terror. "She thinks I'm her father," Thane said, his voice a low, raspy growl that sounded like it hadn't been used for kindness in a lifetime. Halen moved closer, checking the monitor. She met his eyes, her gaze piercing through the dragon to the man beneath. "Maybe she doesn't care who you were before you walked through that door. In this room, you're just the person holding her hand while she walks through the valley." She reached out and adjusted the blanket over Noem's legs, her hand momentarily brushing Thane's scarred knuckles. He didn't flinch. Halen realized then that he wasn't going to room 402. He couldn't. He was trapped in a mercy seat of his own making, caught between the life he had built and the soul he was suddenly rediscovering in the dark. The nurse lingered for a moment, a silent witness to the miracle of a predator turned protector, before she retreated back into the pale light of the hallway. The room settled back into its heavy, violet-hued stillness, broken only by the rhythmic puff of the oxygen concentrator. Noem stirred, her eyelashes fluttering against her cheeks like the wings of a dying moth. When she finally opened her eyes, the glassy haze of the fever seemed to have lifted, replaced by a clarity that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice a ghost of a sound. She squeezed his thumb, her small face turning toward him. "You're still here." Thane felt a lump form in his throat, a physical obstruction that no amount of cold resolve could swallow. He should have corrected her. He should have told her he was a stranger, a shadow passing through. But the grip of her tiny hand was a tether he couldn't bring himself to cut. "I'm here," he rasped, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears, soft, jagged, and terrifyingly human. "What do you do at work?" she asked, her eyes searching his face with the relentless curiosity of a child. "Mommy says you go away to help people. Are you a doctor or do you build things?" Thane looked down at his hands. In the dim light, the dragon tattoos on his knuckles looked like ancient charred remains. He thought of the warehouses he had burned, the lives he had dismantled, and the empire built on the final debts he collected. He thought of the silenced Glock still resting against his ribs, a tool designed for the sole purpose of unmaking. He had spent his life as a destroyer, a man who specialized in the architecture of ruin. But as he looked into Noem's expectant eyes, the truth felt like a poison he couldn't let her touch. "I'm a builder," he said, the lie tasting like ash but feeling like a prayer. He leaned in closer, his broad frame shielding her from the clinical cold of the room. "I build safe places, big walls to keep the wind out, and roofs so strong that the rain can't get in. I make sure that everything is solid so people can sleep without being afraid." Noem smiled, a faint, fleeting movement that lit up her pale face. "A builder," she repeated, her voice drifting as her strength began to ebb again. "I knew it. You have strong hands. You have to be strong to keep the monsters away." Thane closed his eyes, a single shuddering breath escaping his lungs. He felt the crushing irony of her words. He was the monster she was talking about, the very nightmare he was now promising to keep at bay. Yet in the sacred silence of the ward, the lie began to feel like a vow. If he couldn't change his past, he could at least be the man she believed him to be for as long as she needed him. He wasn't just holding her hand, he was building a sanctuary in the dark, one breath at a time. The stillness of the room was shattered by a sharp, insistent vibration. Against the silence of the pediatric ward, the buzzing of the phone in Thane's pocket sounded like a chainsaw. He didn't want to answer it. He knew exactly who was on the other end, and he knew that the world he had left behind in the hallway was calling to collect its own debt. With his free hand, Thane gingerly fished the device from his coat, keeping his thumb firmly anchored in Noem's grasp. The screen's blue glare was blinding, an intrusive neon light in the sanctuary of the violet shadows. The caller ID read Min-gyu, his most loyal lieutenant, the man currently standing guard at the elevators, waiting for the signal that a rival's life had been snuffed out. Thane pressed the phone to his ear, but he didn't speak. "Boss?" Min-gyu's voice was a low, urgent hiss, crackling with the static of a high-stakes adrenaline rush. "The security rotation just finished. The hallway to 402 is clear. We've looped the cameras for another 90 seconds. If you don't move now, we lose the window. Is it done? Give us the word so we can prep the exit vehicle." Thane looked down at the child. Noem's eyes were closed again, her breathing rhythmic but shallow, a tiny candle flickering in a vast, cold wind. He looked at the gun-shaped bulge in his expensive wool coat. Beyond that door lay the crown of Seoul, absolute power, the end of a war, and the respect of every syndicate from Busan to Incheon. All he had to do was stand up, walk 50 paces, and fulfill the destiny he had spent 10 years carving out of stone and bone. "Boss, you there?" Min-gyu's voice grew more frantic. "The elders are calling. They want confirmation. If we miss this, the syndicate falls apart by morning. Lee survives, and we're the ones on the run. You have to pull the trigger." Thane felt the weight of the phone, a portal to an empire, against the warmth of Noem's palm. It was the ultimate choice, the blood of his enemy or the peace of an innocent. If he left, he saved his kingdom but executed the last remaining part of his soul. If he stayed, he became a traitor to the only family he had left. The pressure in his chest was agonizing, a physical crushing of his heart between two worlds. He looked at the heavy door to the hallway, then back at the girl who believed he was a builder. "Abort," Thane whispered. His voice was no longer a growl. It was a final, chillingly calm decree. "What? Boss, I didn't hear you. We're ready to—" "Abort the mission," Thane said, his voice gaining the ironclad authority of a man who had already accepted his own death. He ended the call and let the phone slip from his fingers. It hit the floor with a dull thud, the screen cracking and going dark. He didn't care. He turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with Noem's, and leaned his head back against the chair. He had traded a throne for a plastic hospital seat, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the dark. The first gray light of dawn began to bleed through the hospital blinds, turning the violet shadows of the room into a pale, ghostly blue. The rhythmic hiss of the oxygen concentrator seemed to slow, keeping time with a heartbeat that was becoming a faint, receding echo. Thane had not moved. His back was stiff, his eyes burning with exhaustion, but his hand remained a steady, unyielding anchor for the small girl who was now drifting toward a distant shore. Noem's eyes opened one last time. They weren't glassy anymore. They were clear, reflecting the morning light like still water. She looked at Thane, and for a fleeting second, the dragon saw something in her gaze that felt like recognition, not of the father she had lost, but of the man he had become in the silence of the night. She didn't look afraid. She looked like someone who had reached the end of a long journey and found a friend waiting at the gate. "The light is everywhere now, Daddy," she whispered, her voice a mere vibration against the air. "It's so warm. Thank you for staying." Her fingers, which had been gripped tight around his thumb, slowly began to relax. The tension that had defined her small frame for weeks ebbed away, replaced by a profound, hollow stillness. The monitor beside the bed emitted a single, long, unwavering tone that pierced the quiet of the ward. Thane didn't flinch. He didn't pull his hand away. He sat there as the weight of her life departed, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than any stone. He waited for the familiar coldness to return, the icy void that usually followed the presence of death. He waited for the guilt of his abandoned mission or the fear of his syndicate's wrath to settle in his gut. But it didn't come. Instead, Thane felt a strange, terrifying lightness. It was as if the years of blood, the final debts, and the suffocating crown of the black sun had been carried away in that last soft breath. The hand that had held hers, the hand scarred by 1,000 sins, felt clean. He wasn't the victor of a gang war, and he wasn't the king of soul. He was simply a man who walked a child to the edge of eternity and stayed until she was safe. He leaned forward, gently placing Noem's hand on her chest, and for the first time in 20 years, Thane wept. They weren't the tears of a defeated man, but the first stirrings of a soul that had been resurrected in the dark. The cup of his old life had passed, and though he was now a man with nothing, he felt for the first time like a man who was truly free. Thane stood up, his joints popping like dry wood in the absolute stillness of the room. He reached into his coat and pulled out the Glock 19, the weapon that had been his constant companion and his only god for a decade. He looked at it for a moment, seeing not a tool of power, but a heavy, rusted anchor to a life that no longer fit the shape of his soul. Without a sound, he opened the bedside drawer and placed the gun inside, sliding it shut on the dragon he used to be. He walked out of the room, passing the nursing station where Halen Moore stood. She looked up from her charts, her eyes meeting his. No words were exchanged. She saw the change in the set of his shoulders, the way the predatory edge had been blunted by a grief that was holy. She gave him a single, slow nod, a silent benediction for the man who had traded his crown for a child's peace. The hospital doors hissed open, and the morning air hit Thane's face. It was cold and sharp, smelling of rain and the awakening city. The Black Sun lieutenants were gone, having scattered into the shadows of the alleyways when the order to abort came through. He was alone. He was a traitor to his syndicate, a target for his rivals, and a man without a kingdom. Yet as he walked toward the Han River, he felt a strange, buoyant peace. He reached the water's edge just as the sun broke fully over the horizon, turning the river into a shimmering sheet of liquid gold. Thane took off his charcoal wool coat, the expensive blood-stained skin of his old life, and let it fall onto the muddy bank. He rolled up his sleeves, exposing the dragon scales that coiled around his forearms. In the harsh light of the new day, they looked like fading scars rather than symbols of power. He knelt by the water and plunged his hands into the freezing current. He scrubbed his skin until it was raw, washing away the smell of the hospital, the scent of expensive leather, and the invisible stains of 1,000 sins. He watched the water swirl around his fingers, imagining it carrying the dragon out to the deep, dark sea where it could never return. When he stood up, he didn't look back at the glass skyscrapers of the business district or the boardroom where he was supposed to be king. He turned toward the rising sun. He had no plan, no soldiers, and no name that the world would recognize. He was simply Thane, a man who had been a destroyer, who had lied and called himself a builder, and who was now going to spend the rest of his days making that lie the truth. The sun rose higher, and for the first time in his life, he didn't cast a shadow of fear. He simply walked.